Good morning, or afternoon-ish. My body still doesn't quite know what time it is, so I'm glad to be here today, and I appreciated Ivana's talk earlier around inclusive UX. I'm going to really dive deep into one facet of inclusivity, which is accessibility. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment a handful of scenarios. So first things first, imagine that you're driving to a job interview. You're feeling a mix of excitement, a little bit nervous about the prospects of starting a new job. Before you hop out of your car to give one last look at yourself in the mirror, make sure any food in your teeth, makeup's good, hair styled all nice, there are no smudges, nothing like that. You open the door to your car, and you climb out, you walk across the parking lot, and you head down a set of stairs, and you don't really think twice about it, right? Everything's good. You go to your interview, it all goes well, you get a new job, it's fantastic. Now, take a moment and imagine that you arrive at a building for a job interview. You're also feeling excited about the prospects of a new job, but there's this underlying feeling of anxiety. You exit your automobile, you roll across the parking lot, and there's no ramp. Your wheelchair can't climb stairs, and you immediately feel this sense of panic. You don't really know what to do. How can you get into the building? Now imagine that you're in your mid-20s. Your vision is 20/20 or better. You're at the peak of physical health. All of your devices are new. You have a nice, crisp, high-resolution screen. And you live in a major city that has reliable, high-speed internet. It's a pretty good life. Now imagine that your vision isn't quite 20/20 anymore, and like roughly 65% of the population, you wear glasses or wear contacts or something similar, and like 1 in 10, you're also colorblind. You also have dyslexia, and your phone is 3 years old. You can't really afford a new one, and your data plan caps out at 3G and a gigabyte of a month. Now, the internet connection where you spend most of your time is sometimes slow or just doesn't work. So imagine that for a moment. Now imagine that you can't see at all. You use a computer with a screen reader, your mouse is mostly useless to you, and you use keyboard or voice commands to try and interact with the web. Now, if you woke up tomorrow knowing that you would have to consider some type of disability, and you had the opportunity to build something new for the internet, something new for everyone, what would you decide to build? How would you build it? What would your priorities be if those were your circumstances? And what problems would you try and solve? Now, when we build things, we have to think about the things that we don't necessarily deal with in our daily lives, because somebody else in their life, they really have to. So now imagine the frustration of the individuals who use things designed by people who don't take into account their basic needs. So we're going to dive in today a little bit about accessibility and the responsibility that we have as designers and developers in the products that we create to make sure that we're focusing on whether or not somebody with low vision or no vision or some type of mobility disability can use the website or the application or the service that we're trying to create. Now, in the physical space, we tend to focus on whether or not somebody can use a wheelchair or something similar to enter a building. Now, accessibility is way more than that. And now, if there's anything that you get out of our time together this morning, I want it to be this one thing, is accessibility is inclusive, it's empowering, and it also allows for individual independence to live their lives. It also ensures that people aren't excluded or feel frustrated using something that's been poorly thought out, and they can accomplish what they've set out to do within a similar amount of time and effort as somebody else without a disability. Now, for the designers in the room or the UX folks in the room, I think we've all been there. We've attempted to determine the kinds of people that are using our products and services. We give them names, at least in the United States, we give them names like Jane and John and Sally. Now, here in Croatia, it might be more along the lines of Jakov and Luka or Anna or Petra. So Say, for example, we have Anna. Anna's a mother of two. She drives a station wagon. Jakov is busy father working as a taxi driver. Petra is retired and has to ask her grandchildren for help using this thing called the internet. Now, I dare to guess that in the majority of cases when we're creating personas, we have the ideal type of human in mind. We don't think about the variations that exist in the world. And in most cases, we fail to take into account the wide range of abilities that an individual has. Now, in Croatia, roughly 10% of the population have registered as having some type of disability. Now, Croatia was one of the first countries that in the world to agree to be bound by the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the United States, we have something called the ADA, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, that dictates how we have to build specific services for individuals in the U.S. And those specifically apply to anything that's involved in government, healthcare, and the financial services space. The failure to fulfill what the law requires could result in you being sent to court, sued, and in some cases in the U.S. those have been very costly lawsuits of $20–30 million. Now, the money's not the most important part of that, but we're legally held liable if we don't conform to the law. Now, there are a large range of abilities that people have in their ability to see and hear. There are issues with dyslexia, autism, dementia, stress, access to education, and these all affect a person's literacy levels. It also affects their memory. Diseases like ALS, age, other conditions that affect physical ability, they impact a person's mobility, their dexterity, their strength, and the level of pain that they have to deal with on a daily basis. Now, at some point in our lives, we might experience temporary disability caused by illness or injury, and eventually we're all going to grow older, and our vision will probably decrease, our hearing will probably decrease, our ability to move around will probably be a bit more cumbersome, and it will be more difficult for us to interact with some of the services and products that we're building for other people. So I want to talk a little bit about inclusive design and what that really means. First things first, design starts with identifying user needs. Now, if you don't know who your users are, what needs they have, you won't build the right thing. It's just as simple as that. So it's important to do research, to analyze your data, to not make assumptions around who we think our users are, and to have empathy for those individuals. And we need to remember that what they ask for isn't necessarily what they need. Now, all too often, things are designed with the perfect user in mind. They have money, they have a good internet connection, they can move around great, they have great vision, they know how to use the internet, and we just expect them to be able to do everything without any problems. Now, the reality is, people's ability, that their functional abilities, they vary widely. Sight and hearing ranges from perfect to none at all, with a full spectrum in between. People's literacy levels and memory vary due to common conditions like dyslexia or autism, dementia, and stress. And then physical ability vary with differences in mobility, dexterity, and strength, levels of pain. The second thing is that experiences can be contextual. Now, we're not designing for a screen, we're designing for people. Now, they may interface with whatever we're building through a screen, but that's really not the focus. So we need to think hard about the context in which they're using the services that we're building. Are they in a library? Are they on a phone? Are they only really familiar with services like Facebook? Have they even ever used the web before? There are still numerous individuals that don't use the web every day or use it seldom. So we all have experiences of temporary disabilities that are caused by illness or injury, and we experience those situational disabilities such as not being able to hear well due to a noisy room, not being able to see well due to bright sunlight. So there are varying situations, and the context is important on how we're designing our products and services. Now, UK.gov, they've already brought up before, they have a simple way to evaluate, and I've sort of co-opted their method here. So at the most basic level, for something to be accessible. A person needs to be able to complete the task or a series of tasks without being encumbered. So there are essentially three principles that the UK government has tried to identify to make it easy to identify accessibility needs. The first one is making sure that what we build is perceivable. So the information provided, it must be available to one of the senses: sight, hearing, touch. If information is provided as text, for example, and the person uses sight to see it, if the person has low vision or is blind, the person needs to be able to hear it, typically through some sort of screen reader. If the person is both deaf and blind, they should be able to touch it through typically electronic braille devices. The second is making sure what we build is understandable. The information needs to make sense. There are many people that struggle to process and retain what they need. I have a terrible memory, short-term specifically. Things just don't stick in my brain. So sometimes people struggle with dyslexia, or they're on the autism spectrum, or they have a brain injury that impacts their comprehension. The information should be plain and aid in their comprehension as they're trying to interface with the products and services that we're creating. The third is making sure that what we build is operable. Now, what that means is that somebody using a keyboard should be able to do everything a person using a mouse should be able to do when accessing a site or service. Somebody using a mobile phone should be able to access anything on the mobile phone using their voice instead of their finger. So taking into account the three principles allow for us being able to create more robust experiences for the individuals using what we're building, and it allows people to complete their tasks that they're trying to accomplish. Now, when we talk about accessibility, especially for those of us that build things for the web, we typically focus on screen readers, and typically only screen readers, but that's only a small part of what we're building for, because people have different sensory, cognitive, and physical abilities. So all too often things are built for the fictional average person, the ones that have perfect vision, perfect health, the ones that can use a mouse, that can see the screen. So someone who has perfect vision and hearing, and they have good basic literacy. So very few people are actually like this when you take into account that a person's abilities change based off of their situation. So first things first, we have visual impairments, and these are classified as a number of things. One, you could be colorblind, and you can't perceive the difference between some colors. I worked for a large enterprise company a while ago, and the CEO was colorblind. He was, I think, blue-green or red-green colorblind, and everything that he saw was fairly muted on the color spectrum. And there were some things in the application we were building he just didn't quite perceive well enough, especially things that were regarding state or error messages that typically do this red-green color scheme for whatever reason. That's what we do. You may have low vision, so you need to increase the text size in your browser or on your phone. Or you have low vision and you need to use a screen magnifier to make things bigger. Or you may be blind or have really low vision and use a screen reader. Or you may be deafblind and have to use some sort of braille device to access that information. The second would be auditory impairments. So you're hard of hearing, you struggle to hear most things. Or you may be deaf and sign language is your first language. And you find English or Croatian or whatever the language to be hard to read and write. The third would be motor impairments, where you may have a mild motor impairment and struggle to use a mouse or something that requires fine control to interact with the interface. You may have medium motor impairments, where using a keyboard is almost impossible. Or you may have severe motor impairments and are unable to use a mouse or a keyboard, so you have to use some sort of speech recognition software. Or you may have a speech impediment and struggle to communicate by speech at all. And you feel more effective when you're using some sort of text-based communication. And then the fourth would be cognitive impairments. So you have dyslexia and you struggle to process written text. You may be on the autism spectrum and you have more of a literal understanding of what that text means. Or you may have an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and you may find it hard to concentrate in certain scenarios. You may have a learning difficulty and need things to be simple and easy to understand. Your memory may be terrible, and you may get confused easily, or you may have epilepsy and seizures are triggered by flashing content on the screen. So everything we build should be inclusive. It should be legible, and it should be as readable as possible. Now, if we have to sacrifice elegance to accommodate that, so be it. We don't really lose anything, but we add so much more. So we're building for needs, not audiences. Accessibility isn't something that's either true or false. It can only really be measured in relation to a specific ability or scenario. Something that can be accessible to some people while being accessible to others. That's not the goal. So there are a few things that we can take into account specifically when we're trying to design for accessible experiences. One of the easiest things is color contrast. Now, roughly there are over 140 trillion color combinations that we can use. Obviously, some of those are not accessible. But at least, let's say 1% of those are accessible. That still gives us about 140 million color combinations that we can use. So that's more than enough to choose the combination of colors that are accessible in the interfaces that we're designing. Now, the suggested ratio from the WGAC is a minimum ratio of 4:5:1. So there are a number of tools that can help. There are color contrast analyzers for both Mac and Windows. There are even plugins for some of the design software we use, like Sketch. There are also some online tools that look like this, where you can input your color palette and essentially check text on top of colors to make sure that your contrast is high enough to match or pass accessibility guidelines. The second thing is it's important to convey information with something more than color. This helps ensure that users who aren't able to or have difficulty with distinguishing one color from another. So you typically use some level of iconography and text along with color to make sure you're conveying the correct information. So this includes people who are colorblind. This is roughly 1 in 12 men, 1 in 200 women. And then folks that have low vision, about 1 in 30 people, or people that are blind, and this is about 1 in 198 people. The third thing is structure and hierarchy. This is extremely important as we're designing interfaces. So as we're structuring the page, specifically around typography, it's all really about how values relate to other values. So if you've ever looked at the website, especially one using large font sizes and fill, that something looks a little bit off, it's probably not a problem with the use of large font sizes. It's more than likely the result of not using an appropriate typographic scale as people are scrolling down the website, because you lose the relationship between sections, because your structure and hierarchy is off, not necessarily the large font sizes. Now, as you observe people using these types of websites, it seems like the norm is that people tend to bump up the font size to begin with. So conversely, it's rare that you see somebody decreasing the font size because it's too big to read. For the most part, I think we've moved away from tiny font sizes on the web, but they still exist. The fourth thing would be labels and forms. Now, designing forms to be usable for the average human is still very hard. So there are varying trends that exist between the relationship between the form label, and the form field. The use of placeholder labels, hover and animated labels, top or left labels. And I think the most common sin that we create as designers and developers would be the focus indicators. So making forms accessible rely heavily on focus indicators so people understand the relationship between the label and the field, and if they're using their keyboard, how they're tabbing through the interface. So for the front-end developers, you see this a lot, and a lot of times we set it to 0. That's a bad idea. Stop doing that. So the intent of unstyling was a noble gesture, but it removed the default focus styles with the intention that designers and developers will replace them with something that is both visible and matches the style of their web pages. In most cases, they just don't put anything in, so you can't see the tab state. Now, it's easy enough to dislike the gray dash borders or the hover state that shows up when you focus on something, but don't do it. Now, when we talk about specific rules. I'm not exactly sure what the legal ramifications in Croatia are, but on the web, we do have a set of rules that we can begin to incorporate into the designs that we do. So the W3C has created WGAC. They're currently on 2.0. These are the web content and accessibility guidelines. Now they've divided those up into 3 levels. Level A is the minimum that we should be focusing on every time that we create a website or a service, where you're dealing things with like non-text content. So if you have images and video, you should provide a text alternative. There should be captions for something that's pre-recorded if possible. You're dealing with the information and the relationships with that information to make sure that it's coherent. Your use of color, your audio control, your keyboard control, making sure that if somebody is navigating with a keyboard, they don't end up in a rotational cycle and not be able to get out of the trap. Make sure that timing is adjustable, pausing, stopping, and hiding video and audio content, flashing things on the screen, 3 flashes or below. And then things like language or on focus or input or error identification if something is task or form heavy, so that people using a screen reader or a keyboard understand what's wrong and how to correct. Then we go up a level, level AA. This is typically where we try and focus on. A lot of this has to do with audio, video, captioning for live video, live audio, being able to resize text, have a text version for what's in your images, having multiple ways to navigate the site, making sure that the areas of focus are visible if I'm tabbing through, making sure our navigation is consistent, the way that we identify things in the interface are consistent, and then providing stronger suggestions on how to course correct when there's an error. And then when we get to AAA, this is the most advanced. If you, in the United States, if you work in government or financial services, you typically have to comply to AAA. And it takes a good bit of work because most teams aren't accustomed to building this way. So if there's video, you have to have sign language involved as well. If you have to have alternative media for things that are pre-recorded. You have extra levels of contrast constraints that you have to deal with. Low or no background audio because it's a distraction for a number of people. Timing, interruptions, authentication. These are all things that you have to take into account if you're trying to create a truly inclusive experience. So I'd like to close for a moment with a video, and then we'll field some questions.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new.
3 miles to the summit.
You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like this one. When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
Not necessarily intended to be an ample ad, but it's a great idea or a great story around trying to build inclusive experiences. Now, the woman, she was actually the video editor for the commercial. She has severe motor disabilities, but that there's been software created to allow her to do her job, to do what she enjoys. Now, we have the opportunity to truly make what we create inclusive. It doesn't require a lot of work. It doesn't require a lot of effort. We have amazing advances in technology that allow us to create better experiences, that allow us to make inclusive experience for everybody, not just the perfect version of what we think those personas may be. Accessibility isn't just about checklists and specs. It's about building inclusive solutions, empowering people, and allowing for independence more than anything else. It also creates an environment in which people don't feel excluded or frustrated trying to use what we're creating. The goal is to make things as inclusive as possible, to exclude no one. This can be done by trying to make sure that there aren't any barriers that make it impossible for somebody to accomplish their task, to access their content, or to use what we're building. We want things to be easy to use and to be able to use by everyone. So I appreciate your time this morning or this afternoon. My name is Bermon Painter. You can find me online, pretty easy to find. I also hold office hours every Friday, typically Friday morning, but for Creatious from about 1 to 3. These are all done online. So if you have any questions about accessible design or building things to be inclusive, or I'm also a big root beer fan. If you want to talk about root beer, if that exists here, hit me up. We can chat anytime. Thank you for your time.
That was awesome, Bermon. Thank you so much. And we have some time for questions. If anyone has them, please raise your hand high and I will come deliver the mic to you.
What questions do you have? Give me at least 2.
Yeah,
There's one.
come in.
All right. If I had a root beer, I'd toss it at you.
Hey, Vernon. It's not a real question, though. That's a llama, right?
It is a llama.
What's the story behind it? Let's start with this one.
So this was lovingly created by one of the designers on my team. We had done, so in November, United States, you have Novembeard. So all of the men on the team were growing their beards out, and I was getting kind of scruffy. And we made goofy pictures, and she took it and photoshopped it on a llama. I thought it was hilarious, so I started using it as my closing slide. So good question. I appreciate it. What other questions do you have? All right.
I actually have one question. Since you talk about accessibility, and I actually also have some sort of disability myself because I have a hearing impairment.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about how can the level of some disability affect how useful can be some of accessibility features you mentioned.
So let me try and rephrase the question.
How, for example, different levels of disability can affect how useful can be some of accessibility guidelines you mentioned.
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about disabilities, specifically making sure that things are understood, I think correct? If you have a hearing disability, that also typically leads to some level of a speaking impairment as well. When it comes to a website, you probably typically rely on hearing when you can, but also written text more than anything. Or do you do sign language?
Well, I'm not that much.
Okay.
My hearing impairment is that nature because I took a lot of exercises. My hearing impairment actually isn't that much visible because I work a lot on myself, so I can communicate normally.
Right.
But well, actually, sometimes when I'm actually, for example, watching something, reading something instead of hearing, it can help a lot actually.
Right.
So it probably depends on a case-to-case basis, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to hearing impairments or low hearing, you're mostly working with things that are video or sound-based. So if you're trying to conform to things to make that easier, for video content or audio content, the lowest level is making sure there's a transcript. One of the better things to do is to have captions on the video more than anything else. That there are pretty good technologies that will actually have the written text, and as the audio goes through, whether it's video or just audio only, it'll highlight the written text as the audio is going through, so you can match the written with what you're hearing. If you're doing a live event like this and you're broadcasting, what we'll see some conferences do is that they'll either have an interpreter here, or they'll have a captioner kind of sitting in the back with another screen that's doing captions live. That's like the best of the best in terms of making things an inclusive experience for everybody for a live event. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Question
What other
over
questions?
here.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi. As a designer, I like to try and do things at the beginning so that companies and everything don't necessarily see the extra, or not necessarily extra, but extra touches that you do to make things more inclusive. But how do I talk to them and convince them that it's worth perhaps extra time or budget for the things that really are extra, like captioning takes extra time, or if you're going for the AAA, the sign language on videos and that sort of thing. What are some ways to talk about that, or to lower the footprint on companies' budgets so that they actually take the accessibility and seriously and help it make it easier for us to do it? Because I love the ideas, but it's hard to convince companies to actually follow through with it.
Yeah, you're spot on. It is hard. For designers, I think it's a little bit easier sell. If you're trying to convince your team to do more accessible design, that the extra work that it takes is minimal, because you're already working with font sizes and color ratios and contrast in general. You're already working with how you're organizing information. You're just doing so in a mindset or frame of mind that is geared towards everybody, not just a subset. So that's a little easier because you can just do it. I would consider that your job. It's not something extra that you do. It's just part of how you do your work as a designer. On the development side, there's a little bit more effort involved in some of that work. Now, doing basic accessible markup, that effort's minimal. It's more effort if you're retrofitting that on something that you should have done in the first place. But if you're using ARIA, for example, which you should, they're essentially just specific tags or attributes that you put in your markup to make sure that markup is accessible to a screen reader. The screen reader technology is improving greatly. I would also, that's part of your job to write accessible markup. I mean, if you're a front-end developer, it's part of your job. So you should just do it. The cost is minimal. From both the design and development standpoint, you don't need somebody's permission to do your job. When it comes to caption and transcripts and specific things like that, that's a bit of a sell in the company. Now, you have to elevate those conversations to make sure that you're not using design or development language to a business person. You have to speak in using language that the folks that manage the money understand, and you're typically relating all of that back to your customer base and revenue as much as you can. Odds are that the company has customers that aren't the perfect version of what we consider like full health, full vision, full hearing with no disability. And it's in their best interest as a company to make sure that they're tailoring to all of their customers, not just a subset. Because the odds are that they're probably losing revenue, they're probably losing trust and confidence with their customer base by not doing simple things like transcription or captioning. There are numerous transcription services out there, captioning services that are relatively inexpensive that you can tack on. But you have to, at that level, you have to have a business conversation with those individuals more than anything else. For the design and the dev work, that's just part of your job and it just should be done. Did that answer your question? Yes, thank you. You're welcome.
Great.
So my question is a bit related to the previous one. So let's say that you manage to convince your company that accessibility is good to do. So let's say you have an average agency, it has some 25, 30 developers. And so what would you say, because accessibility is a joint effort, what is some good balance of advocates that you should have inside? Is it lying more on the UX design side or a front end? So what's some sort of a ratio of people who should be working / propagating? Is it more on the developer side or rather in the UX?
It's kind of a team effort, I think, more than anything else. The designers, for example, in the agency, that they have their role to make sure that the designs and the interface are inclusive, from the way the information is organized and the way that flows, the size of the fonts, the contrast with text to the backgrounds, the experience. If you're building something task-based or conversion-driven, making sure that conversion funnel is inclusive for everybody. And then that partnership happens typically with your front-end developers. And there's really not a ratio on who should and shouldn't focus on it. Everybody should focus on it, really. Again, because I kind of feel like it's part of the designers and developers' job to think that way, because it's not that much more effort. It's just changing your current process. Now, when it comes to taking the work that the designers have done and to translate that into the functional interface using like HTML and CSS and JavaScript, you have to change your coding style just a little bit, but it's not going to cost you twice as much time to do that work. It may be like a quarter of an increase in time in the beginning, and that reduces once the developers have become more familiar with weaving in accessible markup, but it's not a huge increase in cost or time. So it's everybody's job, not really a ratio. And the ones that can affect that the most would be the designers and the developers on your teams. And again, you don't have to wait for permission to just start to do it. You don't even have to make a big deal of, we're going to do accessible design and development now. You can just kind of do it. Odds are the leadership at the agency aren't even going to notice, because you're still doing your job and you're still getting designs out, you're still writing your code. It's just better. It's better in the sense of anybody can use it. Did that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? All right.
Hello, my name is Sergey. Thank you for the talk. I have a practical question. Do you have some tips how to encourage your colleagues to start thinking about accessibility? Because usually if one person thinks about accessibility in the project, he or she is alone in the project, and it's more the exception than the rule. How to make the rule for all the people, so they will think about accessibility from the really beginning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges on teams. You're typically going to have maybe one or two people that they went to a conference talk or they read some articles and they really believe that it's important. It is now their job to be essentially evangelists within the team to try and convince the other members why it's important, why we should be spending our time to do a little bit extra to make things inclusive to everybody. Some of the things that we've done on our teams, because we have a similar challenge sometimes, because I work at a consultancy, so we're client-facing most of the time. And our clients, in most cases, some of them don't care. They're not highly technical, they're business folks. Sometimes their teams don't care. And we do a few activities to try and help them understand why it's important. One of those is what we'll do, like really simple lunch and learns, to do some training with our internal teams or with the client team, to talk about accessibility, how it works, why it's important. We'll try and weave in a strong story that maps back why we're doing this to their specific customers, so they understand that we're not talking in technical terms. We're talking about human beings and people, and those people just happen to be their customers. And if we do this little bit extra, we're able to build something better for all of their customers, not just a subset. So as a business, they have gains there. From a purely technical perspective, if you're you're getting buy-in from the rest of your teams to do that work. The designs that you create are better. The code that you write is better. It's easier to maintain. It follows more consistent standards because you are aligning to approved guidelines on how to write your code, how to make it accessible. There's a lot of really good information out there on how to write accessible front-end code for the developers that essentially you're just adjusting slightly how you write your code and you're adding on different attributes to make them more accessible. It's not that much more work. And if you can make sure that the owners of the agency or the owners of the firm and your teammates understand that by spending a little bit extra time, doing a little bit extra to make the designs better and the code better, the team is building a better product for your customers. Now you might have one or two individuals that just couldn't care less. They're probably folks that should be let go from the company because they're impacting how well the company can service their customers. You're welcome. Any other questions?
I actually have a quick question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about accessibility testing and perhaps tools to show me if I'm working on a site, this picture doesn't have a label yet, this needs a screen reader thing, whatever?
Yeah. So there are also amazing tools out there, and I wish they existed years ago. A lot of it before used to be fairly manual. So on the design side, there are tools that are built into Sketch that help with accessibility. There's our specific applications that run on your Mac or on Windows that mimic color blindness or low vision, so you can see what it looks like for somebody else. On the development side, if you're using a build framework like Node, for example, Node has a couple of different services or tools that you can build into your application. So just like when you're writing unit tests or anything like that, you can tie those in, and it will also test your entire application for accessibility guidelines. So it'll typically comply to the WGAC, and it will check your color contrast, it will check your markup, it will check your text, it will check your forms, it will check your errors, and then it essentially gives you a report on how everything stacks up based off the guidelines, and then you can have basically a task list of things that you can work through either from a design standpoint or a dev standpoint to make sure that your accessibility tests are passing just like they would a unit test. And I can send a list out, and they can send this out to the group if you want actual links.
And our last question.
About different sign languages. People don't realize, but even in English, American Sign and British Sign are two different languages, sign languages. So Croatian Sign Language is completely something different. Yeah. So how do you deal with that?
So that's a really good point. So when you're dealing with sign language and you're having somebody sign a live event or a video, for example, one of the questions would be, who is our target market? So if you're targeting, English language and that's kind of what you're focusing on, you would probably have English sign, but that's not where you stop. You typically couple sign with transcripts and captions to make sure that it's fully inclusive. So even if the sign language interpreter is keyed towards US only or North America only, you still have the captions and the transcripts. In some cases, if you're serving a global audience, then you probably want to have variations of who's doing the sign for you. And then you have captions and transcripts in those specific languages that you're targeting. Now, if you're a global firm, that probably shouldn't be a big deal. If you're a smaller company, then trying to make sure that you have the funding and the budget to do that is important. But that's again, one of those stronger business discussions. Cool. All right, thanks everybody. It's been great.
Please give another round of applause.